I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, and last night, standing in the middle of a ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers and 300 wedding guests, I learned just how invisible a mother can become to her own child. My daughter Sophie was radiant in the $15,000 gown I had quietly paid for, raising her glass to honor another family as though I had never existed. Her words echoed through the marble hall, warm applause filling the air, while my presence was nothing more than a shadow tucked at the edge of the room. In that moment, I slipped my phone from my purse and pressed send on a single text message. Just one, and I knew it would unravel the evening within 60 seconds. People often imagine a wedding as the happiest day of a parent's life, the reward for years of sacrifice. But for me, those 60 seconds were the beginning of something far different. They were the start of a truth that could no longer stay hidden. And as I looked around that glittering room, I realized sometimes the most expensive part of love isn't the money at all. It's the silence you carry when no one bothers to see you. Sophie's voice carried across the ballroom like she was standing on a stage accepting an award. She spoke about love, about family, about how the Millers had embraced her dreams and lifted her higher than she ever thought possible. The guests clapped softly, some leaning in with those sympathetic glances that cut deeper than any insult. They thought they were witnessing a sweet correction, a daughter showing gratitude to her in-laws. But what I felt was something closer to erasure. I sat still at my table, my hands resting on my lap. Every word from her mouth a reminder that my years of sacrifice had been rewritten into a story where I no longer belonged. Do you know what it's like to watch your own child thank strangers for the things you bled yourself dry to provide? It feels like standing in the middle of a crowd screaming silently, while everyone around you hears only music and laughter. I told myself I could remain quiet. I could nod, smile politely, and disappear into the background as I had done so many times before. That would have been the dignified thing. But something inside me had shifted. 46 years of motherhood, of working 2 jobs, of clipping coupons so Sophie could wear brand names instead of thrift store finds, all of that rose in me like a tide. I pushed my chair back, the sound of wood scraping against marble sliced through the room, cutting her speech in half. Heads turned. Even the string quartet stumbled to a halt. My body trembled, not from fear, but from a lifetime of swallowed words finally pushing to the surface. I wanted to leave quietly, but my pride wouldn't let me. My voice, low but steady, carried just far enough for the nearest tables to hear. In my heart, I was no longer asking for recognition. I was demanding to be seen. And in that moment, I realized that silence had been my prison, and standing up was the first step toward breaking free. The silence that followed my chair scraping across the marble felt heavy, almost unbearable. I thought I would simply walk out, collect my coat, and vanish into the cold night. But before I could take another step, I heard Evan's voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it carried with the weight of truth. He looked out over the sea of stunned faces and broke the illusion that everyone in that room had been clinging to. He told them what no one else dared to say, that I was the one who had paid for the wedding. Every last detail. The flowers, the ballroom, the dress my daughter was wearing, the dream they all assumed the Millers had provided was nothing more than my sacrifice hidden behind their polished smiles. The gasp that followed was almost theatrical. 100 champagne flutes froze mid-air, and somewhere in the back of the room, one slipped, shattered, and sent crystal shards scattering across the floor. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering, not sure whether to look at Sophie, at her new husband, or at me. And I stood there, completely still, my heart pounding, but my face calm. I didn't need to add a word. The truth had finally spoken for itself, louder than any defense I could have made. For the first time in years, I felt the room see me. But this wasn't the end of the story. That single confession would only be the first crack in a much bigger facade, one I had been silently carrying for far too long. The truth hanging in the air that night didn't begin in that ballroom. It began decades earlier, in the quiet corners of my life where no one was watching. When Sophie was little, I worked 2 jobs. I taught during the day and cleaned offices at night. I told myself it was temporary, just until I caught up on bills. But temporary stretched into years. There were nights I'd come home after 11, peel off my shoes, and find her asleep on the couch with her homework spread across her chest. I would kiss her forehead and remind myself it was worth it. She would have more than I ever did. I used to skip meals so she could have brand-name sneakers for school. I bought generic coffee and off-brand cereal, but she wore clothes that looked like the other girls in her class. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with coupons spread like a deck of cards, choosing what I could sacrifice so she wouldn't feel the weight of poverty. That became my rhythm, my way of loving her, and it never stopped. At 22, she wanted a graduation trip to Europe. I said yes, even though it meant putting groceries on a credit card. At 25, she dreamed of grad school. I co-signed the loan, even though I was already working on paying off my own mortgage. At 30, she needed help with a down payment. I emptied what was left of my savings. At 34, she wanted a professional certification. I quietly sent the check. Each time, I told myself it was just this once. Each time, I believed it would be the last. But the truth is, my silence was the pattern. My giving became expected, not appreciated. By the time the wedding came around, I had convinced myself that covering the costs would be my final gift. I refinanced my home and opened a line of credit. The first withdrawal was $3,000. Then it grew, little by little, with every invoice I approved, every contract I signed, until the number sat at $87,000. I thought I was protecting her dignity, giving her the kind of celebration that would make her proud. But what I had really done was trade my own dignity for her illusion of status. And as I looked back, I began to see it clearly. This wasn't about a wedding. It was about the years of sacrifice that had taught my daughter to expect my silence as much as my love. The truth in that ballroom was only the first crack. The deeper fracture was still to come. For years, Sophie spoke of the Millers as though they were untouchable, a family wrapped in wealth and prestige. She believed marrying into their name would open doors she could never reach on her own. And for a time, I let myself believe it too. Their home looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Their vacations displayed like trophies on social media. Their conversations sprinkled with mentions of clubs and connections I could only imagine. But if you pay attention long enough, you start to notice what isn't being said. When the wedding planning began, I waited for their promised contributions. Patricia spoke of contacts in the catering world. Charles hinted at having a family florist. They smiled, they nodded, but nothing materialized. When invoices came due, I saw blank lines where signatures should have been. I picked up the phone and called the vendors myself. No contracts, no deposits, no Millers. Just me, my credit line, and my signature at the bottom of every page. The truth was simple. Though painful to admit their wealth was image, not substance, they knew how to look rich, how to sound connected, how to glide through life as though money was no concern. But when it came time to act, to actually pay, they disappeared into the background and left me holding the bill. And I let it happen. I told myself it was easier this way, that maybe Sophie would never know, that perhaps believing her new family had given her the wedding of her dreams would make her happy. I convinced myself my silence was a gift. But silence has a way of becoming a trap. What I thought was protecting her dignity was actually enabling their deception. And the more I paid, the more invisible I became. That night in the ballroom, as the truth cracked open, I understood for the first time that the Millers had played their role perfectly. They gave Sophie admiration, charm, and status. I gave her the only thing that truly mattered, the money. And somehow, I was the one erased. What happened next forced me to decide whether I would keep allowing that pattern or finally choose myself. The ballroom seemed to freeze after Evan spoke. For a long breath, no one knew how to respond. Sophie's smile faltered, her hand gripping the stem of her glass a little too tightly. And the Millers shifted in their seats as if they wished the floor would open and swallow them whole. Conversations that had once flowed like champagne now trickled into uneasy silence. I braced myself for shame, for the kind of humiliation that makes you want to shrink until you disappear. But what I felt was something altogether different. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel weak. For the first time in years, I felt visible. It struck me that all the years I thought I was protecting Sophie by staying quiet, by covering costs in the shadows, had actually done her no favors. My silence had been mistaken for consent, my giving mistaken for obligation. And here, under the harsh light of truth, I realized I had a choice. I could keep carrying that weight, or I could set it down. The room eventually filled again with awkward chatter, but I heard none of it. My thoughts were louder than the clinking silverware or the string quartet's uneasy return to music. Inside, something was shifting. My pride was no longer tethered to how Sophie presented me. It was rooted in the fact that I had survived, provided, and endured, and I no longer needed her validation to make it real. I straightened my back, folded my napkin, and let the quiet dignity of that moment wash over me. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: silence would no longer define me. I thought I had finally drawn a line, but the storm was only beginning. Just a few days after the wedding, David reached out. His voice carried a weight I hadn't expected. For the first time, he sounded less like a polished groom and more like a man who had been shaken awake. He told me quietly that the truth about the wedding payments had made him realize something frightening. He admitted that when he first agreed to buy the house Sarah wanted, when he supported her plans for fertility treatments, and even when they talked about her leaving her job someday to be a full-time mother, he had done so because he believed there was money in the background, money he assumed I had. The words landed heavy in my chest. It was like hearing that my daughter had built her entire future on a foundation of illusions. Illusions she had carefully crafted by twisting my sacrifices into some imagined fortune. David confessed that he had thought I was wealthy, just conservative. He said Sarah had told him I was overly cautious with my money, too frugal to enjoy life, and that if push came to shove, I could easily cover their needs but chose not to. That revelation broke me more than I expected. My daughter hadn't just used me as her silent bank. She had painted me as a selfish woman who hoarded resources while she struggled. She had taken my years of sacrifice and turned them into a cruel story that made her look like the victim. I listened as David explained how deeply he had relied on those lies. He had signed off on a $7,000 house offer, believing I would step in. He had nodded to $15,000 fertility treatments, assuming I would help. He had trusted in Sarah's assurances that I was their safety net. Now he knew it was all smoke, and the realization was unraveling his trust in everything she said. As he spoke, I could see the fear behind his eyes. He wasn't just a groom anymore. He was a husband staring down the truth that the woman he had married had built their future on deceit. He told me he wasn't sure how to move forward. He wasn't sure if there was even a marriage worth saving once all the illusions were stripped away. For the first time, I didn't feel like the humiliated mother in the shadows. I felt something closer to vindication. I had carried this burden for years, quietly, alone, and now the truth was out in the open. Someone else, someone who mattered to Sarah, was finally seeing her the way I had. But there was no joy in it, only a quiet ache. I realized that my daughter wasn't just entitled. She was trapped in a cycle she didn't even see, a cycle I had helped create by never setting limits, by always finding a way to make things happen for her, no matter the cost. David asked me if I thought Sarah could change. I didn't know what to say. Change, I told him, doesn't come from shame or pressure. It only comes when a person chooses it for themselves. And I wasn't sure if Sarah had ever learned how to choose anything except what benefited her in the moment. That night, lying awake in my small bedroom, I replayed every sacrifice, every quiet decision to give up my own dreams so she could chase hers. For years, I had believed love was measured in what you gave up. But now I wondered, had I confused love with enabling? The cracks in Sarah's marriage were now wide open, and I knew things were only going to get worse. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, my phone began to ring. At first, I thought it might be Evan, reaching out after the chaos. But when I saw Sophie's name, my heart sank. I let it go to voicemail the first time, then the second. By the third call, I finally answered, bracing myself for the storm. Her voice poured through the line, full of urgency and trembling with emotion. She wasn't asking how I was. Not really. She was grasping for control, trying to reframe everything that had happened the night before as a misunderstanding. She wanted to smooth it over quickly, to convince me that things hadn't been as harsh as they felt. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about damage control, about making sure her perfect image wasn't shattered completely. I listened, my chest tightening with every word. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she acknowledge the years of sacrifice that had been laid bare in front of everyone. Her words were carefully chosen, but the heart of them was clear. She was worried about herself, her reputation, her future. As I sat in the quiet of my living room, staring at the phone pressed to my ear, I realized something that both broke me and freed me. Sophie wasn't calling to heal our relationship. She was calling to make sure I didn't take away the version of the story she wanted the world to believe. And in that moment, I knew the battle wasn't over. The wedding might have ended, but the fight for boundaries had only just begun. A few days later, I thought the storm might finally be quieting down. I hadn't heard much from Sophie since that morning, and a small part of me allowed hope to creep in that maybe she was reflecting. Maybe she was realizing the truth. But then the call came. Not from her. From my bank. The branch manager's voice was calm, professional. But underneath it, I caught something else: hesitation. Maybe even pity. She explained there had been a request to increase the credit limit on my home equity loan. The paperwork was neat, official, complete with a signature that looked so much like mine, it made my stomach churn. I felt the air leave my lungs. That signature wasn't mine. I didn't need to ask who had done it. I knew. Sophie had seen me sign forms all her life: school papers, checks, tax returns. She knew every curve of my handwriting, every loop and slant. My hands shook as I sat in the bank office, staring at the forged documents. It wasn't just a request for a few dollars. She had tried to raise my debt limit to $75,000, and she had done it without hesitation, believing she could get away with it, believing that even if she was caught, I would protect her. It was betrayal in its purest form. This wasn't manipulation. This wasn't guilt or pressure. This was theft. I drove home in a haze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For so many years, I had told myself I was helping Sophie, that my sacrifices were for love. But now, I was staring at the truth I never wanted to admit. She saw me not as her mother, but as her safety net, her personal bank account, her last resort. And in that moment, my heart broke in a way it never had before, because I realized she would rather forge my name than face her own responsibilities. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The forged signature still burned into my mind. And I whispered to myself the question I had been avoiding for years: how much more was I willing to lose before I finally said enough by the next morning? I knew what I had to do. It wasn't an easy choice. It tore at every fiber of me as a mother, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Protecting Sophie had turned into enabling her, and enabling her had turned into losing myself. I drove to the police station, my heart pounding in my chest like it wanted to burst free. Sitting in that chair, telling an officer that my own daughter had forged my signature, was the hardest confession I've ever had to make. Part of me wanted to soften the edges, to call it a mistake or a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a moment of weakness on Sophie's part. It was a deliberate act. The officer listened patiently, took my statement, and explained what would happen next. Fraud was fraud, no matter who committed it. My hands trembled as I signed the report, realizing the irony. For years, Sophie had signed my name to get what she wanted, and now I was signing my own to take back my life. Walking out of that station, I felt hollow, yet strangely lighter. For the first time in decades, I wasn't covering for Sophie. I wasn't carrying her burdens, and I wasn't making excuses. I was standing up for myself, for my future, and maybe even for her. Because real love sometimes means letting someone face the consequences they've worked so hard to avoid. It was the breaking point, the moment when everything I had tolerated finally demanded a boundary. And though it hurt more than I can ever explain, I knew deep inside it was the only way forward. The call came 2 days later. The detective on the line explained, almost gently, that Sophie had been taken into custody at her office. I imagined the shock on her coworkers' faces, the whispers that would follow her down every hallway. My heart clenched. I never wanted my daughter's life to unravel in public like that, but I also knew she had chosen this path. Hearing that she was being charged with identity theft and attempted fraud felt surreal. Words like felony and arraignment seemed too heavy, too final, to be attached to the child I once rocked to sleep. But the truth was unavoidable. This wasn't about who she used to be, but who she had become. For a moment, guilt surged through me. I wondered if I had gone too far, if maybe I should have kept this within the family. But then I remembered all the nights I had bailed her out, all the times I had covered her mistakes, and how each rescue only led to a bigger disaster down the road. Protecting her hadn't saved her. It had only delayed the reckoning. Sitting alone in my kitchen, I let the quiet sink in. The house felt different, lighter somehow. For years, it had been filled with the weight of unspoken debts and unacknowledged sacrifices. Now, for the first time, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not relief, but peace. Because I finally understood that love isn't measured by how much you give without limits. Sometimes, the deepest love is found in letting someone fall, even if it breaks your own heart to watch. The fallout had begun, and it was painful. But beneath the pain, I sensed the faintest glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Sophie might learn something real this time. Months passed, and Sophie's case moved through the courts. She eventually pled guilty and was sentenced to serve time, followed by probation. Evan filed for divorce not long after. The future she had been so desperate to construct, lavish weddings, expensive homes, carefully polished appearances, crumbled like sand slipping through her fingers. I didn't visit her in prison. For the first time in decades, I chose not to be her shield. It wasn't out of hatred. It was because I finally understood that my constant rescuing had stolen from her the chance to grow. She needed to face the weight of her choices without me absorbing the cost. In those quiet months, my life began to change in small but profound ways. I learned how to enjoy mornings without the buzz of crisis calls. I savored evenings with a cup of tea and a good book, not the anxious waiting for the next request. I took walks without carrying invisible debt on my shoulders. And slowly, I began to rediscover myself not just as Sophie's mother, not as a provider, but as a woman who still had a life to live. For the first time in decades, I could breathe without guilt. I could spend without fear. I could finally dream for myself, not just for someone else. Looking back, I realized that what happened wasn't just the collapse of Sophie's illusions, it was my own rebirth. Painful? Yes. Heart-wrenching? Absolutely. But necessary. Because some prices are simply too high to pay, even for love. And that's the lesson I want to leave you with. Love doesn't mean endless sacrifice. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They are the deepest form of care. For yourself and for the people you love. Because sometimes, the only way to truly love someone is to let them face the truth. If my story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences in the comments. Because your voice matters. And if you believe in stories that remind us we're not alone in the struggles of family and love, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Because at the end of the day, we are all learning how to balance love with self-respect, and that journey is worth sharing together.